Chapter 13. Fighting to Survive. The Bloodborn reacted fast. As soon as the door opened, they attacked. Many of them carried bows. Arrows rained down around Varun and Vala. Most of the arrows bounced off of Varun's armor and scales, but a few lucky shots penetrated. Even though he was doing his best to shield Vala, a few arrows still hit her. Thankfully, none of them were able to do much more than tear her clothes and leave small cuts. She pulled a small cloth bundle filled with powder out of her bag, but realized that she had no way to light the fuse. She grabbed 2 more and tossed them to Varun. "Fire! Light it!" He lit them easily with a small breath of flame, then tossed all 3 behind him. As the powder inside the bundles burned, thick smoke began to fill the room, obscuring everything. They reached the door, but more arrows rained down, blindly fired from the cloud of smoke. They ran on, almost to the main door. Suddenly, the smoke behind them parted and the Bloodborn rushed into the hall. A figure in black robes stood near the center, holding up a glowing staff. Varun slammed the doors open with his shoulder, nearly ripping them off the hinges. Vala knew that had to hurt. Outside, the sun had fallen below the horizon. The last few beams of light did little to brighten the dark sky. Varun ran for the trees, and Vala followed, but she glanced back at the Bloodborn as she ran. That was a mistake. The dark-robed figure raised the staff and sent a ball of bright light rocketing into the sky. The sudden light blinded Vala, and she stumbled, tripping over her own feet. The light was bright enough to dazzle a normal creature, but Vala's sensitive Doomeran eyes had been adjusted to the darkness for a while, and the light effectively blinded her. She heard Varun run back for her. She was disoriented by the light, and it didn't help when Varun roughly grabbed her, carrying her away from the battle. She wanted to resist, but he could see, and he was protecting her from most of the Bloodborne assault. Branches slapped against them as they fled through the trees, and she could hear them snapping under his feet. Her vision began to return after about 30 seconds, but was immediately taken from her again as another ball of light flashed through the trees. It streaked by them, nearly hitting them. She could feel heat radiating off it as it flew by. She felt Varun's hand brush her neck as he ran, pressing her closer to him, trying to shield her. Suddenly, he stopped. He set her on the ground and ran. For a moment before her vision returned, she thought he had left her to be taken by the Bloodborn, sacrificing her to save himself. She curled up into a little ball, too tired to really fight whoever found her. Once again she could see. She realized that he'd done the opposite of what she'd feared. He'd left her and disappeared into the trees, drawing the Bloodborn away. She started to run back to the camp, telling herself that he was as good as dead already. Her years of being hunted allowed her to temporarily wipe all sympathy for the Thrakai from her mind. Although she knew it would come back to haunt her later, she ran. The room was filled with smoke. Phelan could barely breathe. He fought his way through the slowly dispersing smoke cloud and found Arian. The Talran was on the ground, an arrow in his shoulder. Phelan glanced around for help, having no idea what to do. He'd seen a few injuries during his life, but he was the son of a governor, not a healer. Arian stirred slightly, but didn't wake up. The smoke was too thick to see very much of the room, and when he opened his mouth to call for help, it filled his throat, choking him. Once he was able to breathe again, he turned back to the unconscious Talran. Not knowing what else to do, Phelan grabbed the arrow and tried to pull it out. It barely moved, but Arian winced. His eyes opened, and he gently pulled Phelan's hand off the arrow. Arian sat up, wincing again as he moved his shoulder, and grabbed the arrow himself. He yanked on it. It moved slightly, but still stuck fast. He pulled again, and this time it came free. Arian let out a barely audible curse as the arrow ripped out of his shoulder, dark blood dripping from its tip. Thankfully, the arrow seemed to have missed anything that could cause permanent damage. "Come with me." Arian's voice was tight as he pushed himself up. "We need to go look for survivors." He started back towards the Dark Elf's cell, checking the bodies he found, looking for any signs of life. Most of the guards were still alive, but they were all hurt badly. More Bloodborn joined them, helping the injured where they could. Arian continued through the halls, eventually finding the body of one of his elites. He touched the man's arm, checking how bad he was hurt. After a moment, the elite's eyes opened and he tried to push himself up. It was Tenor. "Sir, I'm sorry. I know I failed," he whispered, kneeling before the Talron. "I let the intruder get to the captive. I know what the price of failure is." He drew a knife from his belt and offered it to Arian, bowing his head. "I'm willing to pay that price, but if I may ask, sir, please, make it quick." Phelan glanced from the elite to the Talron and back. Silence filled the hall. Arian looked at the knife in his hand. He held it up, and the elite bowed his head further. After a second that seemed like an eternity, Arian dropped it. It clattered on the stone floor, and the elite looked up, relief and confusion written on his face. "I don't kill loyal soldiers, Tenor," Arian stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My father may have harsh consequences for failure, but I'm not him. If you feel that you have to reconcile your failure, do it by fighting at my side." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Arian moved on, checking each fallen guard as he passed. The other elite had been hit hard, but he was awake. He knelt by one of the guards, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. "He'll be fine, 6. Arian knelt by the guard, who was breathing, but faintly. "Go get yourself patched up. I need both you and Tenor ready to fight as soon as possible." Vala pushed through the trees, found the river after a few minutes, and let it lead her away. The banks were slick with mud, causing her to lose her footing as she ran. She slipped, falling into the river. The current dragged her downstream a good distance before she could pull herself out. She was soaked and shivering, and her hands and knees were covered in mud from dragging herself out of the water. Blood mixed with muddy water from the reopened wounds in her hand. She checked to make sure she hadn't lost anything, but realized that everything she'd had on her belt was missing, along with the belt itself. The pouches that held her remaining coins, her lockpicks, and the other valuable items she carried were all gone. Without her lockpicks, she wouldn't be able to remove her shackles. She looked back at the river, trying to figure out what had happened, and saw that her belt was lying in the mud not too far away. All of her gear was still there, but something else was too. Varun's insignia, snagged on a buckle on her belt. Her throat got tight, and she realized that she'd just run away and left, after all he'd done to help. She didn't like owing people for things, so usually she just acted as if there was no debt. But now, she felt like she had to go help. He'd earned that much in her eyes. She didn't know how he realized it would work, but he'd somehow succeeded in guilt-tripping her, the person who almost never fell for things like that, by simply leaving that insignia with her. Taking just a second to splash the mud off herself, she started to run back through the trees, retracing her steps and trying to find his trail. He wasn't hard to find. She heard the fight before she saw it. Shouts split the night air, and the clash of metal on metal rang out. Varun was being driven back by the Bloodborn. There were 5 of them, and they were all bearing down on him. Luckily, they didn't expect him to have any backup. Pulling up her mask to hopefully muffle her breathing, Vala slipped in behind the nearest warrior and drove her dagger into his spine. He fell limp, but she was already moving to the next one. This one was wearing full armor, which protected him from both Vala's daggers and Varun's sword. Thinking fast, she jumped onto his back, locked her legs around his waist, pressed her forearm into his throat, and wrapped the length of chain around his neck. He cried out slightly, clawing at the chain, alerting the others to her attack. She pressed harder, drawing a strangled gasp from him. He struggled to pull her off, but she held on tight. Unable to breathe, he soon began to fade, dropping to one knee. Varun attacked the other 3, drawing their attention away from Vala and buying her time. The warrior she was holding tried to move again, but this time he wasn't trying to break her hold. He yanked his glove off and pressed his bare hand to her arm. Cold radiated through her thin sleeve, and small crystals of ice grew around his hand. She held tighter, gritting her teeth against the cold. Within seconds, he went limp, and his hand fell away from her arm. Knowing he'd wake up soon after she let go, she dropped him and began fumbling with the leather gorget that protected his throat. She got it off and sank her dagger into his neck, ensuring he'd stay down. Her mask had slipped back down around her neck during the struggle, but there wasn't any reason for her to waste time putting it back on. Sheathing her bloody dagger, she drew her short sword and attacked one of the remaining 3 Bloodborn. With 2 of the 5 down, the tables had turned slightly. Vala handled the most agile warrior while Varun took on the remaining brutes. The one Vala was facing darted away, yanking off her helmet to sneer at the dark elf. She was part Doomerin, part Shadow Wraith. Wisps of shadowy mist floated around her, and her eyes were an inky black.
"So, the exile lives," she hissed. "I thought we had killed you already. Your mother got many of the other houses involved in the hunt for you, and still many search. Maybe I should return to them once I have your head."
Vala heard a sharp twang from the tree above her. She flinched instinctively, looking up, and saw Talmor drawing another arrow from his quiver. The Doomerin hybrid fell with an arrow through her throat. Her body dematerialized in the shadowy mist as she collapsed to the ground. Baodin ran past her, headed for the remaining Bloodborn. Vala turned to help Varun, but he and the dwarf had the situation under control. Within a few seconds, both Bloodborn lay on the ground with deep cuts slashed across their bodies. Vala glared at Varun and threw his insignia at him.
"Don't guilt-trip me again, you big, stupid puppy dog."
I'm sorry?" He looked genuinely confused. Vala started to wonder if he actually had left the insignia intentionally or if it had just been an accident. She huffed.
"Never mind. Just forget about it."
Talmor and Baodin began checking the fallen Bloodborn, but apparently found nothing worthwhile and turned to follow Varun as he started leading them back towards the camp. Vala could tell that he'd pushed his limit for far too long, but he was trying not to let any of the pain or fatigue he must have been feeling show. She glanced at the dead warriors again, feeling that something was amiss, but she wasn't able to put a finger on it. A bolt of light answered her. She had forgotten about the dark-robed sorcerer. Dazed but not quite blinded, she turned to attack. Ghost-like, the figure drifted down from a nearby tree. The light from his staff revealed the face hidden by his hood. He appeared to be a black-scaled Thrakai, but with the bright glare hurting her eyes, Vala couldn't make out anything else about him. He was much smaller than Varun, and definitely not a fighter. The second the sorcerer's feet touched the ground, Baodin attacked. Launching himself through the air, he landed on the bloodborne sorcerer, crushing him to the ground. The sorcerer squirmed, trying to free himself. Baodin grinned, confident there was nothing his opponent could do. The Thrakai sorcerer wasn't completely helpless, though. He still had one trick left that Baodin had forgotten about. He opened his jaws, breathing a cloud of shadowy, poisonous mist into the dwarf's face. Baodin jerked back instinctively, choking on the poison, moving just enough for his opponent to free one arm. The sorcerer grabbed his staff and lit the tip. A ball of light crested the edge of the staff, blinding Baodin and nearly blinding Vala. He squirmed away from his opponent, who couldn't see or breathe. As he stepped back, he muttered something Vala couldn't quite hear and began to dissolve into shadows. Varun swung his greatsword, but it passed through the sorcerer's incorporeal form. Talmor shot an arrow in his general direction, but he had already disappeared. Baodin cursed as he got up, rubbing his throat. "Are you okay?" Varun asked.
"I'm fine,"
Baodin assured him.
"I've had worse. What was that thing?"
"I'm not sure. He wasn't a full-blooded black-scaled Thrakai. If he was, you probably wouldn't be able to breathe at all right now. He's probably a Thrakai with a bit of something else. Different types of dragons and Thrakai have different breath weapons, which can usually be identified by the color of their scales. Fire is the most common. Most with that ability either have gold, bronze, copper, brass, or red scales. Silver, pale blue, and white have ice. Green and black have poison, and I believe yellow and dark blues, the ones whose power is linked to storms, have lightning. But don't think he would have been enhanced with dragon blood. Unless—" Varun shook his head. "Unless someone found a shadow dragon. Those disappeared centuries ago, though," Talmor mused.
"Okay, great. So different parts of the dragon thing rainbow have different powers, and shadow dragons are gone, Baodin huffed. So what?
I had heard that shadow dragons had a breath weapon that was pure darkness, Talmer explained. I've never seen it, but legends say that if you get caught by the clouds of shadowy mist that they create, you cannot see, cannot breathe, and sometimes cannot even move. I've also heard that they walk between shadows. If the Bloodborn made a hybrid with that ability, who knows what they can do? It would explain how he just disappeared, Vala mused.
All right, I get it. Let's just get back to camp,
Baodin said, noticing blood running from the chink in the Thrakai's armor.
You can't handle another fight like that.
Is that a challenge? Varun asked softly, giving the dwarf a tiny smile to show he wasn't serious. If so, I can go find some more Bloodborn. Baodin grinned and nudged him. Even though the nudge wasn't rough, he still threw Varun's balance off and he stumbled, regaining his balance just before he fell. He wasn't about to admit it, but he was badly hurt. I can find a shortcut back, Talmer said, turning into the trees. Vala followed, listening for the sounds of the river to guide them back. A fire had been lit that night, but Vala could see that it had been kicked out in a hurry. The still glowing embers were scattered out of the fire ring. Vala instantly suspected that something was wrong. She reached the edge of the clearing and was about to continue when an arrow whistled through the air, passing an inch from her head and hitting a tree. "Hands up!" someone ordered, and Vala thought she recognized the voice. "Hands up now, or I will shoot!" She raised her hands, but Talmer pushed past her, about to step into the clearing. She could see a hooded figure crouched in the tree, aiming a bow at her. "Take your hood off!" She slid it off, letting her white hair spill down her back.
"Caliph, it's us!"
Baodin called. The bow was lowered immediately, and the figure dropped from the branch. She pulled her hood off, slinging the bow over her shoulder. It was Caliph. Damien appeared from the bush next to Vala, startling her. "I'm sorry," Caliph said. Her hands were visibly shaking. "We heard a commotion. We thought you were Bloodborn. Talmer and Baodin ran off to see what was going on, and we heard the fight stop, but we didn't know who won." "It's all right," Talmer said soothingly, putting his arm around her shoulder and pulling her close. "We are all safe." "We are never safe," she murmured, accepting the hug. "What about you? Are you all right?" "We'll be fine," Varun said. "The Bloodborn that came after us are dead." Damien yawned, fingering his rapier.
"Told you they were all right," the human mumbled. "We should just go to bed and leave it for the morning."
"Damien's right. It's late," Varun said. "Caliph, calm down. We really are fine." Vala glanced at him, knowing he was lying about being fine, but realizing it would be useless to call him out on it. She wasn't sure how well Caliph could see in the dark, but to her, Varun looked like he was close to being out on his feet. Trying to fight through it, the Thrakai quickly recounted what had happened, leaving out the injuries he'd gotten. "Even though the group we fought are dead, the Bloodborn may still be on our trail," Talmer said, taking charge. "Caliph and Baodin, can you take first watch?" "With the dwarf?" she asked skeptically, earning a dark look from Baodin. Fine, that works." "I'll take the dead watch with Vala. Damien, you get the last watch with Varun." Caliph settled on a branch, bow ready, while Baodin stood below, stroking his axe. Varun and Damien settled down by the tree, both apparently too on edge to try and sleep. Varun began cleaning the partly dried blood off of his sword. Vala settled down in her nook between the branches, closing her eyes and trying to steady her racing heart. She was exhausted, and she knew that she needed to actually sleep. Her trance allowed her to get some rest, but after using it a few consecutive nights, coupled with the stress of the past few days, she was worn out. As the adrenaline faded from her system, the pain of her injuries began to set in, but she barely felt it, already falling into a dreamless sleep. Zarlov paced across the room, assessing the teams. There were 3 groups gathered, led by Aryan, the orc hybrid Ruck, and another warrior who hadn't yet spoken or removed his helmet.
"The king and his men are weak and unfit to rule, and we are nearly ready to begin moving towards the capital. But this incursion may still jeopardize our plans. Rock, you, your elites, and your orcs will search the northeast part of the forest. If you see any sign of the group, you may engage. Arian, you will lead your elites and the rest of your team to the southeast. And you, elite, will take a squad of orcs to the northwest. Understood?"
"Yes, sir," Ruck and Arian said, while the elite simply nodded.
"Is that understood, elite?"
Zarloth repeated, standing in front of the elite.
"Take your helmet off. I want you to look at me when I'm talking to you."
The elite slid his helmet off, revealing short, pale blonde hair, human features, and startlingly bright teal eyes. His gaze locked with Zarloth's, and he stood defiantly. "Understood, sir," he said curtly. "I will not fail you."
"You had better not," Zarloth growled. "Get your team and get moving."
"Yes, sir." Arian motioned for his team to follow. The group had been chosen for stealth rather than power. Phelan thought they were going directly into the forest, but Arian apparently had other plans. Breaking off from the rest of the group, he guided Phelan down 2 sets of stairs deep into the compound. Tenor and Six, who rarely seemed to leave his side, followed as well. The hallways turned to rough, ancient-looking stone tunnels as they went, and the clean scent gave way to a dank scent of stale air. Based on what he'd seen of the compound, Phelan was fairly sure that half of the top floor was made up of rooms to hold new soldiers who were going to be enhanced, and the other half was Zarloth's space. But what that half contained, he had no idea. He'd at least heard of those parts, though. This underground part was a surprise. The main floor had a few bunk rooms for the soldiers, a few rooms for the sorcerer's experimentation, the main room that was used for random things such as announcements, and the mess hall. The first floor underground was supplies, holding cells, more bunk rooms, and a large training room directly under the main floor. The floor they were on now looked like it had been built years before the rest, which gave him the impression Zarloth had built the rest of the compound over a pre-existing structure. Arian stopped at an old wooden door, which looked like it was about to fall apart, and tried to latch it. It didn't budge. He tried again, but it stayed stuck. Drawing a dagger from a hidden sheath in his vambrace, he began trying to jimmy the door open. As he worked on the door, Phelan noticed his armor. It wasn't the single black leather pauldron that he usually wore. It was a full set of dark gray leather armor, accented with thin, dull silver bands. Its dark leather looked too smooth, almost fluid. The Talrin easily blended into the shadows due to some charm or enchantment on the armor. Finally, with the loud creak of rusty hinges, the door came open. Dust and cobwebs covered almost every surface of the small room, but the Talrin brushed them aside, looking for something. It appeared to be an armory. Old, dust-covered weapons lay on the shelves, and decaying armor stood on cobweb-covered stands. Arian wiped a particularly large cobweb off a partly dried, rotted chest and opened it. Inside, Phelan could see a dark bundle of fabric. It was a cloak made of thin, shimmery, blue-black material, and the hem looked jagged and worn. As Arian put it on, the hem began to glow with a faint, almost unnoticeable light. He turned, looking for something else, and as he moved through the shadows, he seemed to meld with them. He would be barely noticeable if Phelan hadn't been looking right at him. He grabbed an obviously well-crafted longbow from a nearby shelf, strung it, and handed it to Phelan. It was made of ebony and seemed to have resisted any ill effects of being left unused for many years. "This is for you," Arian said, holding out a quiver filled with slightly dusty arrows. "It's a nighthawk bow. They're rare. It's easy and silent to draw, but it's very powerful. As long as you hit your mark, you won't have any trouble in a fight." Thank you," Phelan stammered, marveling at the bow. "And here, take this," he offered, holding out a closed fist. "You might need it." He dropped something in Phelan's palm. It was an iron ring, etched with the words that would be too worn to read even if the wood elf knew the language.
"Don't tell my father," the Tauren warned. "He doesn't know I found this place, or much else for that matter." "What does it do?" "I'll explain later. Right now, we should get back to the others. They're probably wondering where I dragged you off to."
Phelan slipped the ring on, following the Tauren through the maze of tunnels.
"One more thing," Arian said, handing a pair of thin leather gloves to Phelan. "Cover that ring. It should help you, but don't let anyone else see it, especially not my father. He doesn't like anyone exploring down here. Now, let's go. We have targets to find."
He used the word targets, Phelan noted. Not people, not even outlaws, simply targets. But that was okay. Right now, that's all they were. Targets. Prey. If Arian found them first, they would get the mercy of a quick, clean death. If the orcs got to them, they wouldn't be so lucky. Fingering the ring under his glove, Phelan followed, pushing the thoughts out of his mind.